Welcome to this episode of the KPMG ESG Experts Podcast. In this series of podcasts, we aim to give you more insights into different CSRD-related issues and sharing some concrete steps you could take to start solving those issues using real-life examples. In this episode, we'll talk about greenhouse gas and decarbonization, and specifically on some challenges around locked-in emissions, data quality, and data-driven strategy. I'm your host, Pieter, but I'm here together with some really nice experts, and I'm very pleased to have with me today Heerali, Tristan, and Michiel. So maybe you can shortly introduce yourselves, and then we can go get along.
It's a pleasure to be here, Peter. I'm Heerali. I'm a consultant with the sustainability team here at KPMG. I started my career with a focus on sustainability in the built environment as an architect, but I further specialized in the systems approach to sustainability, which led me to now working for multi-sectoral decarbonization and climate resilience solutions.
Cool.
Thank you.
Wow, a very different background from me, Heerali. So Tristan Helsloot, been with KPMG for a long time. Right now I'm a director within our Sustainability Assurance department, and I focus mainly on the financial services clients. And one of the major topics there is their decarbonization and their carbon emissions, especially related to finance emissions. So really focusing on that as well. Yeah.
And I'm Michiel. I've been working for 10 years now at KPMG. During my study, I started reading up on climate change, and I became quite concerned about the direction the world was heading into. And I thought maybe this is a nice topic to dedicate my career to, and 10 years later I'm still here. I've been working all that time also on climate, and then every aspect of climate risk assessment. We started with it before the TCFD recommendations were announced. Decarbonization, that became, I think, from 2018, suddenly a very hot topic. And then suddenly everything was translated into ESRS E1.
Yes.
And now we're here.
Now we're here, yes. So that's a really nice bridge towards looking first a bit more high level into the topic of today, greenhouse gas accounting, or greenhouse gas emissions actually, and decarbonization. Why is greenhouse gas and decarb so important in relationship to CSRD? So what is its role exactly? Can you elaborate on that?
ESRS has several elements, of which I will highlight three. One is defining your greenhouse gas emission inventory. Two is to develop a transition plan, which describes how you are aiming to move your business to transition your business towards a pathway that is compatible with 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the third element is to describe how you're vulnerable to climate risk, how climate change or the energy transition is impacting you. And these things are very important. There was quite a lack of standardization in the market. We have from Europe quite high ambitions to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees. Science has defined that as the last state. It's still safe for humanity. Still 70 to 90% of our coral will die off. The Gulf Stream might stop, the Amazon rainforest might switch to a savanna. So it's not something we should be happy to aim for, but it's the last state that is feasible. It's a big challenge to limit the damage to. And ESRS 1 has been defined to make it very transparent how companies are contributing to it. And you see many things in the standard, from locked-in emissions to internal carbon pricing, to what you do with carbon offsetting, that are all there to make it very transparent. What is your contribution to climate change? What are you planning to do in the short, medium, long term? How much will it cost you? How did you translate that into your processes and procedures? And also, how is climate affecting you at the moment, and what are you doing about it?
Excellent introduction, I think. I can imagine that for some clients, as climate is something already longer on the corporate agenda, it has been already in their sight, but also maybe for some people or for some companies actually less, and maybe also for some companies our specific topics within the ESRS related to climate maybe less, are more, let's say, highlighted now than they were in the past. At least I think, Heerali, maybe you can elaborate a bit on what kind of challenges have you seen within clients working with the ESRS and working with CSRD?
Yes, definitely. There's a challenge that I recently came across working with a client, which is a very complex retail value chain. So the CSRD looks into your emissions data and needs far more granularity, which means you need to disaggregate all your emissions data correctly. And when it comes to a complex retail value chain, we talked about them facing challenges at the scoping stage. Now when it is coming to disaggregation, talking about the consolidated entity, but also talking about the investee companies, there is a far greater need for stakeholder engagement, transparent internal systems, data checks and controls, and a data management system in place as a whole. So that is what comes with a complex value chain.
So still a lot of work there to be done.
Definitely,
Yes.
definitely.
Cool, thanks. I think that the CSRD, if I'm understanding it correctly here, is also a bit about transparency, right? It's about giving a starting point where it's clear for all the companies what they're doing from each other, from the greater public. And at the cornerstone of transparency, maybe it's also where the auditor comes in. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the most important conversations that we also had with a lot of clients, that we know there's lots of uncertainty. So how are you dealing with that from an assurance perspective? And there we say, contextualization is really key. So being very clear and know where your data limitations are, and knowing what your stakeholder then needs to know is, okay, what can then maybe be a large estimate, and what might the impact be for the future, or where you are changing year on year the methods to make the information more robust. Okay, what is the impact of these changes? And this is all very important. So really providing that context on where are the data limitations, what kind of estimates are used, what is in scope and what is not in scope. So you know there might be an impact from a scope increase in the future. All these aspects are very important, and I'm actually myself very happy with the current expected standards, because they will remove basically a lot of possibilities to not report everything that you see right now on the other standards. So hopefully we'll get to more comparable information, but still there's going to be lots of divergence because we don't really have sector standards yet. Different sectors will have a different approach on this topic as well. So I'm also really looking forward to how that will look in the upcoming years.
And maybe to complement, I think 99% of all emissions that have been reported are estimates. Yeah, even if you have fuel, it sounds relatively straightforward, but very little companies look into the fuel composition. They just go to a certain website, take an emission factor, multiply the quantity of fuel, and you have your emissions, which is also an estimate. But the trick is how to get the best estimate, and also how to align the effort it takes to the impact of that emission source. You can put a lot of effort into calculating a certain emission source, but if you know beforehand that it will not be significant to your company, I would almost say, why bother? Even the fire extinguishers here on the whole have greenhouse gases in them. But have you heard of any company that is counting the number of fire extinguishers to quantify the emissions? And that is, I think, where the significance or materiality or relevance, there are different terms being used, comes into play when deciding how good do I want my estimate to be.
Hopefully, I would say there is a fire extinguisher producing company that look into their value chain emissions, right? And
maybe,
yes. Look into how many they have sold.
Now with ESRS E1, the likelihood that that's happening at the moment is much bigger.
Yes, and maybe one thing that came by, I think maybe we can zoom in on a little bit, is something on locked-in emissions. Heerali, you went in a bit on it a bit. Maybe you can elaborate a bit more. What does it mean?
Yes. So with the ESRS, you are required to disclose your logged-in emissions. So emissions which are perpetually going to be a part of your value chain.
What could be an example of that?
So a very simple example of that would be for an energy company, a coal power plant which is not close to its decommissioning date today would be a logged-in emission for them until the point of decommissioning. But that also means that until that date, they will have to come up with the transition plan to be able to either mitigate these or to adapt to these, because the threat that poses, which we are now able to identify because of the ESRS, is that this could be a stranded asset. So the emissions that you're logged into today could be stranded assets in the future, again, having very significant financial impacts for your company. And the other issue or challenge which we are trying to overcome is that there isn't very robust guidance currently as to how to quantify these logged-in emissions.
Okay. But it's a very interesting concept. It was not an indicator that was reported by many before ESRS. This is a relatively new concept, but it gives a lot of transparency on the challenges companies are facing with their decarbonization plan. For example, if you have now a boiler on fuel oil, it's a heavy emitting asset. If you exchange it for a natural gas boiler, then your emissions go down significantly, but you don't want to depreciate your natural gas boiler in an accelerated manner. So that would mean a typical lifetime of a boiler is 15 to 20 years, that for the next 15 to 20 years, you have a certain quantity of emissions locked into your operations. And then it could be that you see your greenhouse gases reducing as planned, but if the locked-in emissions start increasing, which wasn't an indicator which was reported on before, you suddenly see, hey, this company is performing in line with expectations, but they will have a huge challenge going forward.
So they will hit the ceiling at some point.
So basically. Maybe I want to divest as an investor. I don't believe anymore that this company has the ability to achieve their long-term commitments, which is a pretty cool thing.
Yeah.
But I think building onto our transparency point, I think this is where I'll add that it's not just transparency and comparability, but also a lot of accountability when it comes to disclosing things like logged-in emissions.
Yeah, of course.
From an assurance perspective, what really interests me on this topic is basically there's so much connectivity also with the financial statement. So you got the assets there. So indeed, you have the depreciation term. So what's your expected value in the future going to be? And do you still have alignment also with your decarbonization plan in that? So are you connecting that to right now or not? It cannot be that you have a transition plan where you say, hey, in 5 years I'm going to have this and I'm going to decommission this, and then still not account for that also in your financial statements. So I think this is also one of those aspects that a lot of companies also still have a lot of challenges with, because right now sometimes the communication between the departments that are doing these decarbonization plans, it's not yet that well also with departments that are doing, for instance, the financial reporting part. So
these are like separate teams, or how should
sometimes they are separate teams. They are finding each other more and more because they are already getting some experience on how better to work together. But this is also, I think, one of the places where sometimes this reporting part goes wrong, if they are not sufficiently connected and aware of the consequences of what they are doing.
But I think this issue is much broader. It also impacts the decarbonization approach in itself. Last Monday I had a discussion with a client, and there the discussion was, okay, we can exchange in the products we sell, we can put sustainable raw materials in, low carbon raw materials, but the costs go up and our clients are not willing to pay for it. And then the procurement team was, yes, but the sales team is also not telling the story right, what we do and how it also helps them to achieve their decarbonization ambitions. Procurement people, we can only sell energy efficiency. That has a positive business case for our clients, but putting more expensive raw materials in, we cannot do anything with it. It will cost our gross margin. And I think by connecting procurement people with sales departments, telling that story much better to the clients, taking along your journey, your challenges you face, connecting engineers on the floor who often have a lot of ideas how they can decarbonize the operation, with C-level who needs to set the direction and who needs to approve budgets. Those are things that are huge challenges. The governance structure is at most clients not there yet to facilitate this whole transition.
And this will be fixed at once by the CSRD?
No,
not yet.
definitely not.
No.
But if you talk about companies that are a bit more advanced on the journey, that set a target, that have their emissions calculated, that want to start steering, there you see that these challenges are suddenly arising, that there's a disconnect and that the governance structure is not supporting. Procurement is now judged on the ability to cut cost. Yeah, suddenly they're going to buy more expensive raw materials because they're low carbon. Then you have a conflict if it's in their remuneration scheme of the incentives in the organization and the direction where you strategically want to push in. And those things need to be ironed out still a bit.
I think also linking to what Tristan said about decommissioning, you can decommission something that is, let's say, non-sustainable in the long term and has locked in emissions, but that costs probably money to do so, but it maybe decreases your emissions. So how does that, what does then prevail? Let's put it like that.
Basically, I would say for every decision that is being made right now, do you have in your business plan not only the impact on euros, basically right now, but also the impact on your carbon targets and other targets. Everything is connected, basically.
And with calculating the business case, do you take an internal price of carbon into account, or from a climate risk perspective, future carbon pricing that could be there? If in 10 years' time you need to pay €300 per ton of carbon, yet does a certain investment today still make sense? And those are things so that forward-looking, and in that ESRS is also different. Traditional annual reporting often looks back. ESRS asks you also to look forward. What are you going to do? What will it cost you? What are your procedures? How are you going to implement?
Yes. How exactly this topic on forward-looking? How do you look at this as an auditor? Because I have a feeling that for auditors this is a very difficult.
Yeah, I think this. There's no real answer to it actually yet. So right now, what we see as an auditor, we often say scenarios and future prospective information is basically often out of scope of our assurance work on non-financial information or sustainability information, and we don't have an answer yet. Okay, I believe we don't have an answer yet, at least, on how we're going to do that also under the CSRD. Is there also going to be part of outscoping, or are we just going to say, hey, these are estimates? So again, you need to be very clear about contextualization. So what is the scenario? What kind of assumptions have you been making? And an auditor needs to then determine, okay, are these assumptions reasonable? Are they sufficiently supported? Is the methodology consistently applied? I can imagine we could also go towards such a route.
It's also been a discussion between maybe following the process and providing assurance on that, or providing assurance on the outcome.
Yeah, no, I think you always need to do a little bit of your assurance on the outcome as well. So in that sense, you can have assumptions, and an auditor cannot just say, hey, they had made assumptions, so we're going to agree with that, and they put the assumptions properly in the right model. No, something needs to support the assumptions as well. And
okay, very cool. So one of the main things I digested from this is that a lot of things have been said, but one of the things was, I think that the CSRD also tries to bring this, let's say, unionization of maybe financial part of a business, of sustainability, of all kinds of departments, and ESRS helps, or CSRD helps to unionize this, or it is needed to be able to comply with CSRD, but this is also one of the main challenges, right? This connectivity within businesses. As well as locked-in emissions, we discussed forward-looking statements. I'm also wondering, there's a lot of challenges, and what are some positive things that you have seen with clients, some nice developments to tackle these challenges, or to be ahead of these challenges maybe even?
I would like to begin by saying that it isn't just about meeting the ESRS and CSRD requirements, but looking at clients working towards establishing assurance readiness on these procedures has been encouraging. We aren't just looking at the accounting per se, but we are looking at the accounting methodologies. We are looking at the tool suites they have. We are looking at the data sources they're using, the data management systems they have in place. So what we have been talking about, the integration, I think this is where the integration begins. When we look at these carbon and climate-oriented processes, but are able to integrate them within their internal governance and strategic systems. And yes, I think that has been something that has been quite rewarding, because again, the ESRS is not judging only the outcome, even though there is a third-party assurance involved. It is also judging the process. It is forward-looking, but in some cases, it is also backward-looking. When you look at targets, they are also asking you for your performance before the baseline years. So it is really looking at this systemic integration, and it's encouraging to look at organizations trying to streamline their value chain, streamline their data, and not just rush towards some sort of immediate compliance.
So it's actually the basis, to have a good basis to end up
The
to have a good report.
foundations.
That is the most important of all.
Definitely.
Can we almost say.
And this entire guideline urges that process.
Yeah.
I think it is tailored to enable this process and not just look at the outcomes.
That's really good to hear. Michiel, do you also have some specific example you would like to highlight of something positive you've seen or something?
Now, what I do like about the standard is that it gives also, it is almost a blueprint for your strategy development, and it gives a lot of room also to focus really on the most material things and the most important things to you. For example, it said you need to report your relevant Scope 3 emissions. Then it's a question, what do we mean with relevant? But to me, it leaves room to decide what is big, where do I want to steer? Okay, then I want to focus my monitoring activities on these. Reporting greenhouse gas emissions is not a goal, it's a tool to assess the effectiveness of your decarbonization emissions. And it allows for that room. So my advice to most companies is also really focus your climate plan. Focus on identifying the levers that will really help you win big on your decarbonization ambitions. Focus your monitoring where it really matters. And there's quite a bit of room in the ESRS standards to do it. It sounds overwhelming when you read it for the first time, but it's actually feasible. And many clients in the beginning, they're a bit like where to start, but they figure out that calculating emissions, that there's a lot of tooling available which support them. Sometimes it's even fully automated and doesn't require any effort anymore. They figure out that there's a lot of knowledge on the floor available at manufacturing firms, engineering department, but also financial institutions. Front office often has a very good idea how their clients can decarbonize, which is their main emission source. So there's a lot of knowledge available, and companies are now triggered to start collecting and combining it. And of course, it's a huge chunk of work, but when you are starting with it, it turns out that you often have more than you expected, and that's something nice.
Maybe the people in the companies might get to know each other a bit better as well.
Indeed,
in between
yes.
departments or not. Maybe that's also a positive thing, right?
But I do want to add, from a more practical perspective, again, that if companies have been aligning by the best practices underlined by the GHG protocol, by the TCFD, have been aligning their targets to SBTi, they are already on their way to the state of readiness. So you might have wins already.
So if we look at, let's say, the group of largest companies, entities that will be first in scope of CSRD this year, you're not that worried in that sense, as most of them might have done some work in this area as well?
I think there are two key differences between the greenhouse gas protocol, and in that way, E1 differs a bit from the other standards. We have already a protocol out there which is well established for the last 15 years. There are two differences. One is it defines that you need to use operational control. So you need to assess over which activities you have management influence, and those you need to report for. The greenhouse gas protocol allows also for a few other options. And the other is now it's also mandatory to get limited assurance. And that's also a game changer because it puts additional requirements on your whole data trail. Otherwise, Tristan will come in and then
so
you'll have a tough time.
So something that changed maybe then, coming with CSRD, if you talk about limited assurance, is that before you were maybe present at companies where they basically asked you, can you come provide assurance? Yes, and now you come anyway, right? Whether they ask you or not.
Now it's no longer voluntary conversation.
So how does that feel?
So yeah, I really liked it the last couple of years with the voluntary conversations, because you're basically, you have a conversation from the perspective, we really want to do better and we really want to do something. So the conversation is maybe a bit different than from a mandatory perspective. But I do hope that all these companies really understand the need for applying this standard and for this reporting, and so we can keep that conversation at the same level, I would say. What really does also help is that to have the conversation at a really early stage, because nothing is more annoying than finding out and being surprised by things that are not going well at a really late stage. So I also highly encourage companies to have that conversation open and honest at an early stage, and that will really help in the future. I had one client that's going to report actually CSRD not in 2024 but on 2025, but they're already in conversation for us on some assurance readiness, for instance, on their carbon accounting, and that really helps up front, because then they can already start solving things also for their baseline, which is already in the past, to be better prepared for the upcoming years.
Okay, so far no very difficult conversations.
Not yet very difficult conversations.
We're not happy to see you, or.
And sometimes we do have some difficult conversations when it relates to data actually, and the data reliability is insufficiently supported, and then that might result indeed in when you have an opinion on it or have to issue an opinion on it in something else than an approved opinion in a sort of way.
Yeah.
And an unqualified opinion.
Yeah, exactly. So if we look very practically, and people are listening to this podcast, might be viewing it, and they really want some practical steps that they can start doing, practical tips that they can start, let's say, implementing in their companies or wherever tomorrow regarding greenhouse gas emissions and decarbonization, and of course related to the CSRD. What 2-3 pointers can you give them?
Don't wait for the perfect data and the perfect plan. You will never get it.
That sounds promising.
No, it's the truth. And in 6 years, if we continue like today, our carbon budget for 1.5 degrees will be depleted. So there is some urgency to act now.
Yeah.
And you don't need perfect data to start steering. And you don't need a perfect plan, because there are many opportunities at most companies with a positive business case to start reducing emissions. So don't wait until you have everything from a monitoring perspective arranged and fixed. Start talking to people, start implementing, and start pushing those emissions down. And the lesson actually here is to learn from each other and to learn from the early movers that started this journey already a couple of years ago. Lego decided a couple of years they want to decarbonize their Lego stones. They want to take responsibility. They care for children, so also for their futures. Let's decarbonize that product. It's made from fossil fuels, from plastic. What are the alternatives? They investigated a bio-based route and a recycled plastic route from recycled Coca-Cola bottles and other bottles. Hired 150 engineers, spent over 150 million euro to see if it could work, and arrived recently to the sad conclusion that it didn't work, that the carbon footprint, after adding so many additives to make the product as strong as the original, so you can click it together and unclick it for millions of times, would raise the carbon footprint to a higher level than the original was. Lesson here is, don't try to do that again. The type of plastic they use is a very commonly used plastic. So any other user, please call Lego, and they will probably be willing to share their experience. Don't make the same mistakes. Time is running out, so let's learn from each other. I see it across many industries. Value chains are partnering up together. Many of my clients are looking for consortia, for example, to structure renewable energy purchasing through PPAs. They see this as an opportunity for value chain collaboration, for peer collaboration to decarbonize, and for me that's a game changer.
Okay.
I think for me it would be identify where the current alignment is. Identify your current wins first to know what the current state is, and then going on forward to streamlining processes and methodologies. I think the first go-to step for me would be this rationalization and streamlining of processes.
So you basically say just take a breather, take a step back. Okay, what do we have already? It might seem a lot that's coming at us, but maybe we can already cross off a lot of things, or we are well underway for a lot of these topics already.
It is about the journey as much as it is about the destination.
Exactly.
In
Beautiful.
this case.
Beautiful. And for all those companies that are a bit overwhelmed by the fact that they have to now report on this, and then also
That Tristan
we'll have an assurance provider coming in soon. How can they? Do you have any practical?
Have an open, honest discussion with your assurance provider soon. I think one of the best things that companies can do is really do a dry run on the data as well, maybe on past years, so you really get through the process and don't skip on parts of that data that you don't want to include yet. Just do the dry run with everything, so you really get to know where the troubles are, and then make sure that you align as soon as possible.
Sounds really good. Thanks again for the really nice conversation, and also thank you for listening to this episode of the KPMG ESG Experts Podcast series. We hope you liked our introduction into the challenges that organizations face around greenhouse gas and decarbonization, and we hope you feel more prepared to take the next steps in your reporting journey. So if you're keen to hear more from our experts on CSRD-related topics, you can subscribe to the podcast via the link in the description. And also next to this, you can head over to the KPMG website to sign up on our ESG Today newsletter, as well as to check out some interesting articles and events on ESG-related topics. See you next time.